Now. Okay.
Good morning, Leah.
Good morning.
By the way, Leah, call me
Yes.
Bev. Bev, not Chana.
You went back to Bev?
Yeah.
When did
Officially,
that?
I'm Chana, but everybody calls me Bev.
Fine. I will call you Bev. Because the last time, one of the last times I saw you, you said that you're now going by Hannah. So I was trying to.
Yeah, that was probably in the very beginning.
Okay.
When I was new and
Okay.
idealistic.
So, and now that things have opened up again, I would love to get together. And I think
Where are you living?
I live in Givat Zev, which is north of the Ramot Mall. Like I live between, like if you go to the Ramot Mall and keep going, that's where Givat Zev is.
Oh,
I
so
tell people
you're
I'm between Ramot and Modi'in.
okay.
But we can even go to Modi'in. I think Tzila is around. I think she's here. She came to get vaccinated.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Oh.
So anyway, but yes, I would very much, I'd very much like that.
I would too.
But I can also come into Yerushalayim. Like that's not a problem at all.
Okay.
Okay. Meeting is now streaming live. Okay. Oh wow, we're streaming live on Facebook. Pressure's on. So, okay, gotta sit up straight. There we go. Okay. Somebody just has to let me know when I'm supposed to start. I feel like the whole world is several minutes off right now.
There are atomic clocks that solve that problem. They're used in the army, and our ex-next door neighbor was one of the people who created them, made them in Israel.
Wow. Wow.
He once explained how they work, but I can't.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's something that was developed by the IDF, I'm down for it. I think they're between even the brains aside, the motive for survival and exactitude is a pretty good motivator.
Okay, Leah, I think we can get going.
Okay. All right. So am I controlling the recording, or are you, or how does that work?
I'm doing the recording.
Okay. All right. Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Yomiyun for Purim by Matan, and I am thrilled and honored to be part of it. For those of you who are in my regular Tanakh and psychology shir, welcome, and this is going to be a psychological bent. For those of you who are not regularly in my Tanakh and psychology shir, welcome, and the shir is going to have a psychological bent. So the title of today's shiur, and I'm going to screen share in a second, is called Motivation, Motivation, Motivation. And we're going to be looking at Megillat Esther through the lens of psychology, and specifically through the lens of kind of what motivates people to act the way they do. In other words, one of the things that I am particularly drawn to and fascinated by and passionate about in studying Tanakh is that these are human beings, that the people of our Tanakh, our role models are humans, and they're flawed, and the Tanakh does not attempt to cover up those flaws. As a matter of fact, the Tanakh, I think, in some ways highlights them so that we can learn from them. Megillat Esther in particular, being that it is part of Ketuvim, so it is very much a written book. And I'm not trying to play on words here. What makes the Sfarim of Ketuvim different, than the Sfarim of Nevi'im and the Sfarim of Chumash is that these Sfarim are very consciously written by human hands. It's what I call in English holy literature, right? There's a Kedusha to it. They made it into Tanakh. Chazal decided these are appropriate to be canonized, but they are very much literature and can be looked at as literature, and they're written to be literary. So to look at Sefer Tehillim, for example, as a book of poetry is part of what Tehillim is, right? When Shlomo wrote his Sfarim of Kohelet and Mishlei and Shir Hashirim, he is choosing his words and using language very, very deliberately. And Megillat Esther in particular, because Esther says, Kitvuni ledorot, right? That this is a book that was written to be written down. It wasn't something oral that was then written down. It was specifically written to be written and copied and transmitted. So the language of the Sefer actually tells us a great deal. And what was particularly challenging for Mordechai and Esther when they were writing Megillat Esther is that they actually had to make it through two different groups of censors. The obvious group was the royal Persian group, right? So they had to be really careful in how they portrayed Achashverosh as a, because he's the king. And this is probably why the Gemara discusses that Achashverosh is either a pikeach, which means he was very shrewd, or he's a tipesh, which means he was a fool. But neither one describes him, number one, as an idiot, because he wasn't an idiot, nor is he described in the Gemara as a Rasha. And the Megillah certainly doesn't describe him as a Rasha. But if you read between the lines, you can see where Achashverosh may or may not have been intentional and where he may or may not have been manipulated. And that's actually the first thing that we're going to look at is who Achashverosh was and why he could be manipulated. But the second group of censors that it had to get through was Chazal, and specifically the Anshe Knesset Agdola. And Rav Yoel ben Nun, many, many years ago, came to Mayanot and gave the faculty a shiur on the history of Megillat Esther. And believe that this shiur is in writing now on the virtual Beit Midrash, the Har Etzion site, of how it actually took quite a while, like a good 150 years before Purim as a Chag was adopted in Eretz Yisrael, right? And again, we think about we're 70 something years into the establishment of the state of Israel, and Yom HaAtzmaut is still something that's debated. And do we say Hallel? Do we not say Hallel? Do we say Tachanun? Do we not say Tachanun? It's not so hard to imagine what it was like in the time of Chazal, and as the second Beit HaMikdash was built or being built, and this is a story of Galut, and does it have a place here in any? So they had to also convince Chazal, and there's the Gemara, I believe it's in Masechet Shabbat, that discusses which Sfarim were or were not debated as to be whether to be canonized, and Megillat Esther is one of them. Shir Hashirim, Yechezkel, and Megillat Esther, the three of them almost didn't make the cut, each for different reasons. But the reason for Megillat Esther not making the cut is pretty obvious, in that it is a story that happens outside of Eretz Yisrael. Hashem's name is not mentioned in the Sefer. And the other interesting piece of it is that there is another version of Megillat Esther, I believe it's actually called Megillat Mordechai, that doesn't make it into Tanakh, right? It's either in the Apocrypha or in the Pseudepigrapha. I don't remember which one, but it's in these Sfarim like Ben Sira, for example, like Sefer HaMaccabim, that don't make the canonization cut. So this version does, but another version doesn't. And the other version is fascinating in that it's much longer. Hashem's name is mentioned in it. There's a whole dream sequence in it. It's really a very fascinating book. But what I want to get into now, and I'm going to screen share. Here we go. Where's my screen share icon? There we go. Okay, what I want to get into is I'm going to take a quick look at our syllabus. And here we go. And by the way, this is not just for the purpose of the fact that it's yellow or white on black, although that works really nicely for my purposes here. But it's also because I'm visually, for those of you who don't know me, I'm somewhat visually impaired, and it's just easier for me to read the screen this way and kind of scroll through and find things. So you're not hallucinating. It's my computer, not yours. So for those of you who are in the regular Tanakh and psychology class, the first part of the syllabus, which I'm going to scroll through very quickly, is what we're going to get back to next week when we talk about kind of the psychological theories behind what motivates us to behave the way we do. But that's the question that we're looking at, is what motivated Achashverosh, Vashti, Haman, Mordechai, Esther to behave the way they did, because they're each human beings and they're coming into this with a set of pasts, of histories, of psyches, that they're not just puppets, they're not just pawns, they're human beings. And the text reveals to us what they are as human beings. But just as a very brief overview here, when we think about what motivates us to act the way we do, we can kind of break it down into two very basic pieces. One piece is biology, right? We are moved to act by instinct, by reflexes, by things that are part of our DNA, part of our biochemistry, and the kind of the overarching piece of DNA and biochemistry is this concept of homeostasis, which is that there's kind of a set point. For example, body temperature, right? 98.6, 37 degrees Celsius. So this is the set point at which the human body works most optimally, right? So the human body is going to do whatever it needs to do to stay at that set point. Right? So in the summertime, we sweat to cool the body. In the wintertime, we shiver. So to warm the body, the hairs on our skin goes up to try and trap heat. There's a lot of things that happen, right? That when we feel threatened, our adrenaline kicks in, right? But this obviously, sets the homeostasis off, which is why when the immediate threat passes, there's this sense of nausea, which is a really real sense, as the systems that had shut down kind of kick back in and then try to absorb the extra adrenaline and the extra endorphins and the extra oxygen that's running through the bloodstream and kind of try and set us straight. So on a biological level, our bodies try and kind of stay at the ideal set point. So psychologically, we have this idea of homeostasis as well. Like our minds are driven and our psyches are driven to really search for that comfort zone. And different psychological theorists, and some of them we've discussed already over the course of the year, and some of them we haven't yet, all have theories of how do our psyches try to find that comfort zone, right? That zone where we can live with ourselves. And for that matter, what is the best comfort zone, right? What is the zone in which we really all strive to be in? And so things that would motivate us, like for example, according to Abraham Maslow, right, we look for self-actualization. According to many of the theories of well-being and mindfulness, a lot of which comes out of Buddhist philosophy and yoga ideas, is that we look for this idea of Zen, this idea of well-being, this idea of a sense of peace within ourselves, a sense of perspective. It's kind of a fusion of cognition and mind and soul. Eric Erikson, who is a psychologist from the beginning and middle of the 20th century, talks about kind of conflict resolution. There's always some point of conflict between the individual and the society around her, and how do we, at each point in our lives, we're looking to resolve that conflict and kind of find a balance, right? So psychologically, homeostasis is finding a balance between my needs and your needs, or my needs and the Torah's needs, or my needs and my spouse's needs, or my needs and my what the job depends on, determines, and my needs and my sense of what's right and wrong, and society's sense of what's right and wrong. In the later part of the 20th century, there was research done on this idea of attachment and security, a sense of like how do we achieve the sense of well-being. And fundamentally, what comes out of all of this research, and again, I'm going to go next week, going to go much more in detail because I want to really get to the Megillah now, is that what human beings are striving for, this homeostasis that we're looking for, is a sense of security. And by security, I mean a deep psychological, emotional, cognitive stability. Um, we talked about the last couple of weeks, we talked about trauma. And the reason that trauma is so devastating is it completely upends that sense of security, both on a physical level, on a neurochemical level, on a brain level, but also obviously on a psychological level, right? That this pandemic is so debilitating because our sense of security and predictability and control have been completely and totally upended. Now, when people are psychologically healthy, and healthy is a broad range, but when people are psychologically healthy, when you're knocked off balance, you can recenter. You can find that homeostasis because you've been centered and you've been balanced before. When people are coming from a position of imbalance, whether it's because very early psychological trauma, whether it's very early societal trauma, victims of abuse, victims of violence, or people who are grappling with mental illness, or who are, in really difficult situations, it's very hard to find that balance again, that sense of stability, and even that kind of very inner sense of stability, right? And that's where a lot of the mindfulness and the well-being and that whole movement is coming from, is that it's not from without, it's within. But on the other hand, there's definitely an outside that we all have to grapple with. So what on a micro level, what we're looking for to some degree is stability, predictability, navigation, knowing what to do, how to do. I mean, this is what therapists help us with. It's what meditation and yoga and the Eastern movements help us with. It's what Chazal help us with. Like you can find this balance in many, many, many different places. But there's also a societal component of this balance, and that's in the societal, the belonging versus the other, right? Like, am I part of a group? Am I part of a network? And again, I think one of the hardest things in the corona world is being separated from our networks, our families, our friends, our bate knesset, our shiurim, our bate midrash, whatever it is that we're separated, right? I mean, obviously, as Jews who have gone through trauma on national levels across the millennia, right? That being separated from our land, being separated from our autonomy. I think it's, particularly for those of us who were born after 1948 and whose, earliest memories are, let's say, in 1970s, this idea of there not being a state of Israel. But on the other hand, I can say as a child of survivors, I'm keenly aware of what happens when we don't have a home, when we don't have a place where we belong, where we can run to. And this, I think, having lived in the United States for the over 50 years, is this idea of I am other. right? I am other in a world that's not Jewish, that's not Israeli. And that in and of itself is unsettling. And how do we respond to that? So what's going on in Megillat Esther, and just, as a student of literature, and again, I'm not going to go into this very much right now, but it's like, how do we motivate and move people to do what we need them to do or want them to do? There's a lot of literature out there, but I think one of the best examples of how, the inside outside, belonging not belonging, is demonstrated in general literature is in Othello, where Iago, who is very much our Haman character, I'm going to scroll back up again here, manipulates Othello, who is very much the outsider, right? Othello is a black man in a white society, and he comes to power because he is a military genius. And if you're hearing Achashverosh here, you're not wrong. He comes to power because he's a military genius, and then there's this character Iago, and what we don't really know what motivates him, and that's why in the Shakespeare opus, he's really the absolute quintessential villain, because the only thing that seems to motivate Iago is messing with everybody else. When we talk about Haman a little bit, we have a better sense of what motivates him, but Iago is what a psychologist would call a classic narcissist, maybe even a psychopath. Um, but and what defines narcissism is this drive just for me, right? It's all about me. It's my power, my needs, my status, and not only a refusal to see what other people see, not only a refusal to take perspective, but actually almost an inability to take somebody else's perspective, which is why narcissism is defined as a mental illness, because there's this degree, just like in somebody with a bipolar disorder, or somebody with a schizophrenic disorder, or somebody with any numbers of mental psychological disorders. There's, just like in a physical illness, right? A diabetic cannot consciously control insulin levels, right? That's what we have medication for, and that's what we have diet for, right? The body's just not able to do it. In true mental illness, there's really a kind of an inability that has to be mediated by medication or therapy or both, or therapies, neurological therapies like EMDR, or any number of these. So narcissism is really a just kind of, it's a blindness to how other people think and feel. So let's jump now into the Megillah and look at these characters. And I want to look at them through the text of the Megillah, and somewhat through the eyes of Chazal. And when I say somewhat through the eyes of Chazal, it's not because I'm discounting, Chas v'shalom, what Chazal are saying both in Masechet Megillah and in Esther Rabbah, but because I am mindful of the fact that Chazal, when they are putting things in writing, right, when Torah Shebe'al Peh gets written down, that there's also an agenda, and that Chazal, the Gemara, and the Midrash are not historical documents, any more than the Tanakh is a historical document. They contain history, but they're not meant to be looked at as primary sources for objective reality. So, best example is this idea that, why did Vashti not come on Achashverosh's command? Because she had a tail. Now, does that mean that Hashem couldn't have created an ace and she grew a tail? Or she broke out and she had measles or chickenpox or some other, full body rash or herpes or whatever, and there was some physical reason for her not to appear? Yes, that is possible. Is it what Chazal were trying to say when they were saying, why didn't Vashti appear? I don't know. That's a completely separate shiur in what what do the Tanaim and Amoraim want to achieve when they are telling us these midrashim, right? They're not fairy tales. It's not Greek mythology. They are very deep moral lessons. So I want to not go down the midrash route because it's complex, and I want instead to stick to the text. So I want to jump into the Megillah and go to Perek Aleph. So I'm going to scroll back up. I apologize. I don't mean to make people dizzy here because right now we're going to go to the table of contents, and we're going to go back to, and I'm just going to look carefully here. We're going to go back to Perek Aleph, right? And we're going to see how, remember, Mordechai and Esther are writing this Sefer very, very intentionally. I also at this point want to insert here the Shita of the Malbim, who posits, and I think makes a very, very convincing case for it, that when Mordechai and Esther are describing people in the Megillah, the way they are described is also very intentional, in that people are described in one of four ways. Either just by their first name, Achashverosh, or just by their title, Hamelech, Hamalka, right? Balayla hahu nadadash nat Hamelech. That's option 2. Or by their title followed by their name, Hamelech Achashverosh, or by their name followed by their title, Achashverosh Hamelech. And each one of those is significant, because when somebody is described just by name, it means that their title or their heritage or their lineage is not at play here. And again, these are kind of value neutral statements. When it's only the title that's mentioned, it's that this person is no longer acting as an individual, but that this person is acting as an official, right? Hamelech Hamalka, HaYehudi. And that when the title and the name are combined, it is because both are at play. And if the name is first, that person is more acting kind of as the individual with the individual psyche and background. And if the name is first, then it's the position that's pushing them. And there's a whole area of study in psychology about what lends people power, right? Started by I think French and Raven wrote the original article around 1959, 1960 about power and like how do people achieve power, and whether it's position or whether it's coercion or whether it's legitimate or whether it's informational, or lots of reasons why people attain power. So how did Achashverosh come into power? There are basically one of two ways that an individual at that time and place could come into a position of power. They could either be born into it, or they could have achieved it by some means of force/violence. So Achashverosh could have become king either because he was the child, the son of the previous king, or because somehow he won a battle, military coup, overthrow. Right? And it's not clear. It's not clear in the historical record who Achashverosh was. This period of time is already very, very documented, archaeologically and in writing. So the fact that there's this individual named Achashverosh that the historical record is a little bit unclear about is telling, right? We know him as Xerxes. Maybe he's Artaxerxes. There's somebody mentioned in Ezra whose name is Ahasuerus. The Greek name might be Cambyses. We're really not sure. And it's also very important to point out that when we talk about Koresh and we talk about Daryavish, Cyrus and Darius, there are multiple Cyruses and there are multiple Dariuses. And that's why, again, like Masechet Megillah places this story between Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. Historically, that's not accurate, because Bayit Sheni was already being built under Koresh, which was, started around 539, 535. Now, by the way, this is probably why the Masechet says that Koresh is the child of Achashverosh and Esther, right? Because if you're going to put this book in between Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni, then Achashverosh has to come before Koresh. But to say that Achashverosh was the emperor of the Persian Empire before Koresh, it just doesn't fit, because Cyrus is the one who overthrew the Babylonians. He's the one who beat the Babylonians and became the first empire. So there's a lot here. And again, I don't want to go down too much of a historical road. There's been tons and tons and tons written about it, but I'm just kind of, to pique your curiosity, the question becomes, why do Chazal and Masechet Megillah place this story where they do? Why do they say that the kelim, mikelim shonim, are kelim from the Beit HaMikdash? Why, there's more than just a historical record. There's a message here. But let's get back to Achashverosh. So Mordechai and Esther, when they write this book, they start off by referring to him just as Achashverosh, right? And not just as Achashverosh, but Achashverosh, who Achashverosh, which Achashverosh is he? Hamolech mihodu v'yad kush. And it's not till the next pasuk, right? Bayamim hahem, kishevet hamelech Achashverosh, that he evolves from being Achashverosh Hamolech to Achashverosh Hamelech. And yet there's yet another caveat here in Pasuk Bet, which is the fact that he's referred to as Kishevet, right? He's like ruling, and the teenagers say like, ki'ilu, right? Ki'ilu hu yoshev. Ma pirush, what does it mean? He's ki'ilu hu yoshev. So here is where Chazal jump in and say, Achashverosh was not born into royalty. Achashverosh was a general. And as a matter of fact, he started off as a stable boy, whatever that means, right? He's a commoner. He's a commoner that rises through the military ranks to become the general, to become the lead general, the most successful general, because obviously there are many generals. And as the most successful general, namely the one who led to the sack of Bavel, he is the one who now becomes king. But he's not royal. And the fact that he's not royal is probably the one piece that is the most dominant motivator and is the thing that leads to his greatest insecurity. Right? Again, Chazal do not look at Achashverosh as being a rasha. Chazal asks the question, was he a tipesh or was he a pikeach? Was he a fool or was he shrewd? You can be really, really smart and be a fool. You don't have to be so smart to be shrewd. So it's not a question of whether he was smart or whether he wasn't smart. The question is how much was he in control of his own behavior and his own choices and his own actions, and how much did he allow other people to play him, to manipulate him, and how much did alcohol have a piece to play, right? So the message here to us is really, really clear, which is number one, there is no excuse for not engaging your brain. Whatever you do, you have to be aware. And you should know that everybody else is engaging their brain and everybody has their own agenda. And don't let yourself get so inebriated that you can be knocked off of your ability to make clear decisions, right? And be careful of the people around you. And we say this in davening every morning, right? That we don't rely on human beings because they're fickle, and we rely on God, right? And that's one of the messages coming out. So that when Achashverosh becomes king, he is not secure. And again, even if he is royal, right? Even if we put that Gemara and that Midrash aside, that he's not royal, he's still the head of a fairly new and very huge empire, right? Right? India to Ethiopia. like half of the known world at the time. The Persian Empire was humongous, and there's no internet, and there are no phones, and there's no cell service, and just the ability to manage an empire of that size is a massive, massive task. So he's not immediately stable on his throne. And l'chol deot, this is the beginning of the empire. This is the beginning of the dominance of the Persian Empire. He has just defeated the Babylonians. And even if he hasn't just defeated it, even if his father has just, or his whatever, we're not so far removed from the domination of the Babylonian Empire. And empires can rise and fall pretty quickly. And like, I mean, think of the Soviet Empire. How long did it last as, as the Soviet Union? 70 years? It's not. And Bavel also, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire, 70 years. So the clock ticks both slowly but also very quickly. So he is motivated by his need, a very objective need to consolidate his kingdom, but also a very subjective need to establish himself as the ruler of this kingdom. Now, what makes this even more complicated for Ahasuerus, or for any emperor of the Persian Empire, is that unlike the Greek, the Assyrian, and the Egyptian empires, the Persian Empire has a constitution, has a set of laws, and very similar to our perspective that even a king is ruled by Hashem's law, the Persian belief system was the same. Is that, and if you look at the Cyrus cylinder, is that Cyrus basically says that I have become emperor because the god Marduk has, shown favor on my father and on me, and I need to consistently make this god happy and follow his laws and follow the laws of the kingdom. And I'm not free to make my own laws. And we see this throughout the Megillah, is that Achashverosh, right, when Vashti doesn't show up, he asks his advisors, what is the law, right? When Esther, I can't go to Achashverosh unannounced because the law is. Even after Haman is hanged, right? Achashverosh says, I can't overturn a pre-existing decree, right? What the king says, the king writes as law is inviolable. You have to figure out a loophole, right? Which is, by the way, one of the sources of the Tipesh Haya Pikech Haya, because on the one hand, he's once again entrusting his power to somebody else, right? Do as you see fit, both with Haman and Esther and Mordechai. On the other hand, he could be seen as very, very shrewd, as like, look, the law is the law, and I have to follow the law, and I can't be made to look like a fool or like a crazy person, and you have to figure out a way out of this. It's very interesting. So Ahasuerus throws a party. By the way, it takes him 3 years to consolidate this kingdom to achieve stability. And then he throws a party, and it tells us very clearly that he's doing it to show off of his wealth. This is very common, right? That's what emperors do, is they want to impress everybody with their wealth and with, don't, number one, don't try and attack me because I'm rich and I have the power. And number two, look at me, I'm rich, and clearly the gods favor me. Right? So there's this combination. But again, for Achashverosh, there's another piece that's motivating him, which is that I might not be entitled to be here because I wasn't born to this, but don't mess with me because I have earned my place, and here's how I'm going to prove it to you, right? By showing you, and the Megillah describes the incredible opulence, right? It says to show everybody his wealth. And then in case you're wondering, right, Hor Kapas, and one second, I'm going to do this so that it's both Hebrew and English. Hang on a second, here we go, right? So Hur Karpas, right? All of this incredible wealth. Like, think of yourself as a set designer, right? Or as an illustrator, like what this palace would look like. By the way, there's a model of Achashverosh's or of the palace in Shushan in the Bible Lands Museum, and it's fascinating. And again, just remember, all of these things had to be imported and carried by and large overland or by ships that were rowed by slaves, right? There's a lot of human labor that goes into all of this wealth. Okay, so he's throwing this party, 6-month long party, lets everybody drink out of gold and silver vessels, which may or may not have been from the Beit HaMikdash, right? And here's again this emphasis on law, right? V'hashtiya kedat ein ones, right? That this was something that the Persians prided themselves on, is that they were law-abiding people, and even the king had law. There's a lecture that you can watch from the British Museum on the Cyrus cylinder. It talks about how the Persian Empire, even more than the Greek Empire, were really the model for a constitutional government, and actually we're pretty democratic, right? We think of the Greeks as being the founders of democracy, and this lecture argues that more than the Greeks, who were still kind of fighting amongst themselves at that point and didn't yet quite have an empire, the Persians were the first empire that instituted this idea of regional autonomy and kind of states and federal and local and national, and law, that the law is, nobody is above the law, and that this was a very powerful force. So everybody's drinking, everybody's partying, and now comes along this woman named Vashti. And I want to point out that Vashti is introduced to us as Vashti Hamalka, as opposed to Achashverosh, who's introduced to us as Achashverosh, and then Achashverosh Hamolech, and then finally as Hamelech Achashverosh. So Vashti comes onto the scene as Vashti Hamalka, and the question is who is she, right? So we know the answer that is given by the Gemara and by the Midrash is that Vashti is the daughter of Baltashazzar, which makes her the great granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She is the Babylonian princess, right? And she is the vanquished princess. She is the exiled princess. And she is the reason, the fact that she is royal is the reason that Achashverosh becomes king. Now, again, whether you want to accept the fact that she is the reason Achashverosh becomes king, or you accept the fact that Achashverosh himself was royal, or that he rose through the ranks and he's the general, what is clear is that Vashti comes with her own lineage, and that Vashti comes from royal blood, and that Vashti has enough of her own power as to be a real threat to Achashverosh, right? Which is why when she doesn't show up, that it's so horrifying to him, and why the reaction is the way it is. So the question becomes is like, what's motivating her, right? First of all, what's motivating her to make her own party, when the party that's being in the middle of being thrown here, right? Let's go back to this, right? That the party that's being thrown these 7 days is, I'm sorry, for the, these 6 months is for the officers. And then the second party, the 7-day party, is being thrown for everybody. So Gam Vashti Hamalka Asta Mishte Nashim, right? And this Gam here harkens us back, and remember, Mordechai and Esther are writing this very deliberately, to the first time we have a Gam, which is that Hevel also brought a korban, right? Cain brings the first korban, Hevel brings Gamhu. And what happens is that Hevel's korban outshines or threatens Cain's korban, and all hell breaks loose from there, right? And murder. And so when we see this gam, it's not just by the way, it's an intentional gam. And that intention doesn't necessarily mean a bad intention. Like when when Hevel brings his korban, it's clearly because he thinks that Cain had a good idea, right? Oh yeah, we should thank Hashem for what we're doing. It seems that Vashti's play here, right, is not quite as pure. That what Vashti is doing, because otherwise it would just be Vigam Vashti, but it's Vashti Hamalka, right? She is establishing her royalty and the fact that she's born into it, and the fact that I'm royal and you're not, or at the very least that I came from Bavel, right? Even though you conquered my kingdom, and even though you killed my father, right? Prepared to die. Well, shout out to Princess Bride, but you killed my father, you conquered my empire, you exiled me from the city of Bavel and its hanging gardens and its, beauty and its magnificence to this Shushan backwater, whatever the heck, Susa, whatever the heck it is, I'm still a queen. And what I imagine is motivating Vashti is a combination of royal outrage, but also a lot of personal grief and anger, right? And I don't think it's being historically anachronistic to say that when somebody's been captured and vanquished, that they're going to feel a lot of grief and anger. It's a trauma. And so she's staking her claim. And then on the seventh day, Achashverosh gets drunk. And again, I just want to point out here that, again, we have this image of Achashverosh of having been drunk for a full 187 days, right? That's the Tipesh Haya. We can also read this pasuk as Pikeach Haya, right? It's only on the last day that he allows himself to be drunk, right? Meanwhile, he's been sober and everybody else has been drunk. But be that as it may, on this day, he is drunk. And what does he do? He calls for Vashti to come, right? Why does he want Vashti to come, right? Again, she's referred to here as Vashti Hamalka, Lifnei Hamelech, right? Please note the Melech, right? I am calling you because I am king. You are first and foremost Vashti, but you are my queen in the sense of you are only Malka because I am Melech. First, you are Vashti, and then you are Malka, right? And I want you to appear in the crown, meaning the crown that I've bestowed upon you. And why do I want you to appear? Because I want everybody to see how beautiful you are. Right? Now, it's not a far jump to say the way the Midrash does, that he wants her to appear in a crown and nothing else, right? Because he is very much pulling a power play. His motivation here is to show, number one, I'm in charge. Number two, I have the beautiful palace. I have endless money. I have endless wealth. I have the beautiful wife who happens to be the princess of the previous empire, and I have the right to demand of her to appear however I want. And then Vashti does something like unprecedented. She refuses. The question becomes, why does she refuse, right? She's not an idiot. Like, first of all, societally, women didn't refuse their husbands. It just didn't work that way. Excuse me for a second. Women didn't refuse their husbands. So what is going on in her mind that she is refusing? Second of all, this word vatima'ein, again, very intentionally, as Mordechai and Esther are writing it, is hearkening us back to another refusal, which was Yosef's refusal of Eshet Potiphar. And we see the consequences that brings, right? So we have somebody who's clearly in an inferior position, refusing somebody who is in a superior position, and not only in a superior position, but we have the outsider, right? The vanquished, the slave, the exile, refusing the insider, the king, Potiphar's wife. And certainly in the case of the Chumash, we know that there's ambivalence or terror, depending on how you read that shalsheled, right? But you're refusing with the knowledge that there are going to be consequences, right? So what is it that motivates us to put our lives on the line against somebody in a position of power? So psychologically, it is that you are more invested in your identity, whatever that identity is, than you are in your life. So in the case of Yosef, right, and here again we have the Midrash saying that he was tempted, and then he saw this image of Yaakov, right? So what was Yosef's primal, fundamental identity was as a Ben Yaakov, Ben Yaakov, Ben Yitzchak, Ben Avraham, right? That was his identity and everything that came with that identity. And we hear tons of stories from the Shoah about how people, ran into the barbed wire, or so that because they would rather die than be murdered, or how they maintained their humanity and shared their last crust of bread, or a soul from an extra piece of leather for to put inside shoes. Is that your identity moves you to invite death. So Vashti is being moved to invite death. And what is moving her is a little bit unclear. Is what is moving her grief? Is what is moving her rage? Is what is moving her this sense of I'm royal and you're not? Is what's moving her as like my autonomy is the only thing that I have left, and because everything else has been taken from me. But irrespective, and it could be any of those and all of those, but she knows what she is doing in this refusal. She's not drunk, right? It's not kitov hamelach lev hamelach b'yayin. It is a clear-headed refusal, knowing the consequences, and that again, her identity, whatever that core identity is, of princess, of Babylonian, of woman, of whatever it is moving her to say, no, I'm standing for that. Chazal see her as just being cruel. Again, that cruel Babylonian, as Nebuchadnezzar was cruel, as his general was cruel. They see Vashti as having a certain degree of cruelty, and as like, I don't care. And maybe what it's doing is it's also sending a message that I don't care doesn't really work very well for us. Martyrdom is not a value that we have. It's we don't see martyrdom or the potential for martyrdom until the very, very end of Tanakh in Sefer Daniel, with Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. So this is not necessarily a value. So we see Achashverosh and we see Vashti, and again we see how Achashverosh here is moved by, to some degree, by the law and his need to uphold the law while balancing his power position, right? Vayomer hamelech lechachamim, right? He gathers around his astrologers and he gathers around his wise people, and he's like, what do I do here? Now again, tipesh haya, you're the king, make a decision, or pikeach haya, he's very shrewd and he knows he can't make a decision without his cabinet. So what we have next, I'm going to skip Mehuman, okay, because again, it's unclear whether this Mehuman is Achashve is Haman or not, right? It certainly makes sense. I'm sorry, Mimuchan, right? It makes sense to say that Mimuchan is Haman, and it makes sense for two reasons. Number one, we have this conservation of characters. This is a concept in Tanakh, right? That names are not mentioned for no reason, and if this guy steps up and gives a piece of advice that the king takes and is happy with, and then this guy named Haman steps up and gives a piece of advice that the king is happy with. It makes sense that Haman and Memucan are the same person. It also makes sense to say that the person that the king is going to elevate above all others is the one who has given him some really good advice in a really, really potentially tricky, potentially international incident situation, right? So, but I'm going to leave that aside for the moment, and I want to move forward now out of Achashverosh and out of Vashti, and I want to introduce us here to Mordechai, to ask us like what motivates Mordechai. So we're going to move into Perek Bet, right? Vashti has been gotten rid of, unclear whether she was exiled or whether she was hanged. I'm voting for exile just because, again, I think having her killed would have had repercussions that Ahasuerus may not have wanted to invite. On the other hand, having her killed would send a very strong message to everybody, like, okay, I am in charge now. And ultimately, the message that Ahasuerus wants to project is that I am in charge. I am the emperor. I am the king. I rule. It's not the Babylonians. It's not anybody else. It might not even be somebody who's born into royalty. I am it. I am king. Okay? So let's meet Mordechai here. Let's see who is Mordechai and what drives Mordechai. איש יהודי היה בשושן הבירה, ושמו מרדכי בן יאיר בן שמעי בן קיש, איש ימיני, אשר הגלה מירושלים, עם הגולה אשר הגלתה, עם יחוניה מלך יהודה, אשר הגלה נבוכדנצר מלך בבל. Okay. Here is Mordechai's identity in a nutshell, and these are the things that drive him and move him. First and foremost, he's an ish. And the word ish in Tanakh, when it is used to describe an individual, like a specific individual, as opposed to a random individual, like is in Sefer Vayikra, an ish always means a person of status and of stature. Veha ish Moshe anav mikol adam, just as an example. That ish is not just a description of one's gender, but it is a description of one's status. So the very first thing that we hear about this individual is that he is an ish. He is a person of status and a person of stature. The second thing that we hear about him is that he is a Yehudi. And this is the first time in Tanakh, and the first time kind of in history, that Yehudi is used to mean Jew as opposed to a member of Shevet Yehuda. Right? Now, the reason we're called Yehudim makes a lot of sense, because at the end, we just were Yehuda and Binyamin, and Yehuda was the dominant tribe. So we are known as Judahites, even though we're not all from Judah. Right? There are those of us from Yehuda, there are those of us from Binyamin, there are those of us from Levi, right? Kohanim, Leviim. And there were plenty of Jews still around from the other Shvatim who were still, hanging out in Israel and had not been dispersed by Ashur. So at the time of the Megillah, we are now known as Jews. So the second part of Mordechai's identity and what moves him is this attachment, this identity that he has as a Jew, and everything that comes with that. The Ben Adam L'Makom, the Ben Adam L'Chavero, the morality, the theology, the monotheism. There are a lot of parallels. There's parallel that's drawn between Esther and Sarah, right? The 127. You can say similarly that there's the parallel between Mordechai and Abraham. Right? And Abraham came from Ur Kasdim, and Mordechai finds himself back in that same basic area. There are also parallels that are drawn between Mordechai and Moshe, right? That he's kind of this anonymous character that rises out, however you want to see him. But clearly he's being motivated by his Jewish, what we would now consider Jewish values, right? And in addition, he was Mordechai. Interesting to note that Mordechai is Marduk, right? Is the Persian god, and it's unclear whether Mordechai was his actual name. We know that Esther's actual name was Hadassah. We don't know what Mordechai's actual name was. It's very possible that just like Avram's name went from Avram to Abraham, and we don't know what Moshe's name was originally, right? We know that he is Moshe because Bat Paro called him Moshe, all of that backstory. So there's a backstory with Mordechai also. Um, and kind of, again, according to the Gemara, he is a contemporary of Daniel, and we know that when these Jews, particularly the high status Jews, entered the courts of whether it was Nebuchadnezzar or Belteshazzar or Daryavesh or Koresh, that they were given Greek, or I'm sorry, Persian or Babylonian names, right? So that it is eminently possible that his name was changed. And it's telling that we don't know what his original name is. But what we do know is Ben Yair, right? Or Ben Shim'i Lishmoa, Ben Kish, right? His lineage and his identity is clear, right? He is of royal lineage. He is one that is a listener. He is one that shines light. I mean, these names are incredibly packed with information, and maybe they were actually his father and his grandfather and his ancestry, but it also tells us what kind of a family he came from, right? He came from a Yarei Shamayim, we would call him, right? The one who's following the light of Torah, following the teachings of Torah, that this is who he is. And he is an Ish Yemini. And again, from Binyamin, according to the Pshat, but he is very much that upright person. And to some degree born of tragedy, just like Binyamin was born of tragedy, right? He is Ben Oni, whose name is changed to Ben Yamin. And that tragedy is the other part of Mordechai's identity. And we see this in beautiful case of Mila Mancha, right? We have the word galut 4 times in one pasuk. So in case we have any doubt whatsoever as to what is like behind Mordechai's Mordechai-ness, right? Asher Hagla, he was exiled, Mirushalayim, with the Golah that was exiled, with the exile that was exiled, with Yechonia, this was what was known as Galut Choreshu Masker, when Nebuchadnezzar, 10 years before the Khurban, exiled the elite, right? Im Melech Yehuda, Asher Hagla Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. Right? And it's really this pasuk that kind of leads Chazal to place the story of Megillat Esther when it is, because it's unlikely that if the story of Megillat Esther was later, right, the destruction was 586. This is taking us back to 596, right? And if this person Mordechai was actually exiled even as an infant, we're talking about somebody who is probably close to, let's say 70, 80 years old at the very least. And it's really a stretch to say that he's 150. People didn't live that long anymore. But be it as it may, that what's driving Mordechai, Mordechai's motivation is his Yirat Shamayim, is his Ben Adam Lemakom, Ben Adam Lechavero, and his firsthand experience with destruction and exile, and what that does to the psyche. And we see from Sefer Chagai and Sefer Zechariah and Sefer Malachi and Sefer Ezra what that destruction did to people. And it changed us forever, right? Between 586 and BCE and 1948 CE, we do not have autonomy. Even once we come back and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, we are subjects of Persia, and then we are subjects of Greece, and then we are subject of the Seleucid Greeks, or the Seleucid Greeks, and then the Greek Greeks, whatever. Then we are subjects of Rome, and then we're done, right? We are never again a completely autonomous, independent kingdom until 1948 CE. That's a long time to be in exile. And Mordechai is at the beginning of that exile. And so he has witnessed firsthand, or feels firsthand, the destruction of his autonomy, of his legacy, of the place that has been independently Jewish and a theocracy, at least on paper, for 500 to 1,000 years. Right? That's a long time. 500 years is a long time. Like, let's take us back. We're in 2021. It takes us back to 1521. Right after the expulsion from Spain, right? And again, you read what was written in the time of that time, right? And they're talking about how they had to live. Why did these Spanish Jews not believe that this could happen? Because they had been in Spain for 500, 600, 700 years, right? They were Jews in Spain back in the 700s. Like, what? We've been here for 700 years and now you're going to kick us out? No way, it's not going to happen, right? But it does happen. So this is Mordechai's identity, and we see this identity as being loyal to the Torah and to halacha twice. We see it at the beginning of Perek Gimel, right? And I'm going to scroll up, right? When he doesn't bow down to Haman. And this is where Chazal jump in and they say, like, what the heck? You're allowed to bow to royalty. It is mutar. It is not considered asur, right? So why does Mordechai refuse to bow to Haman? And the Ibn Ezra here jumps in, and he says that the only way to understand Mordechai's action is to accept the midrash that Haman was wearing a pesel of avodah zarah around his neck. Now, the Ibn Ezra is not quick to accept midrashim. We know this. This is not his way. He's a pashtan. So right away, we have to tune in and say, okay, the Ibn Ezra is telling us something, because the only way that Mordechai would risk his life and ultimately the life of his people in doing what he did was because he felt there was a Yahari V'al involved. Not only that, we know that avodah zarah was one of the things that brought down the first Beit HaMikdash. So what he's bringing with him, what motivates him, what moves him, is not only his own deep, abiding religious conviction, but an understanding of how that religious conviction, how that monotheism, how that Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Ein Od Milvado, when we lose sight of that, what happens, right? What avodah zarah was one of the reasons the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. We can't assimilate. We can't even pretend to adopt the belief system of the other nations. It will lead to our destruction. And Mordechai says that again when he speaks to Esther. I'm going to scroll really quickly to the end of Perek Dalet, and where he says to Esther, right, in this back and forth, and these are words that we recognize and we know this story. So now we're kind of tuning into who's saying these words, right? So he says to her, Vayomer Mordechai lahashtiv el Esther. First thing he says to her, Al tidami b'nafshech. Don't, on a very pshat level, don't imagine, right? We have don't imagine. So there's like this very, again, clear cognition, very clear, that which makes us human is our ability to think clearly, to project, to think abstractly, haroet, hanolad, to think into the future. So it's like, don't think, don't use false logic here to think that you're going to escape, right? That's on a very surface level. But let's look a little bit deeper into the words that Mordechai writes down, or that Esther writes down as Mordechai is saying. Al tidami b'nafshech can also be read as don't silence your soul, right? Don't cut yourself off from who you are as a person. Don't have dam on, right? Al ta'amod al dam re'echa. All of this is embedded, I believe, in these words. And what Mordechai is saying is like, you are not an individual. You are not just a queen in this palace. You are part of a history. You are part of a people. You are part of a community. You are part of an ethos. You are part of an ethic. And all of that, your history, your identity, your ethos, your ethic, your belief system, your commitment to your community, your bein adam l'chaveiro, needs to move you, right? What are the other two Yaharig V'al-Yavors? Shvichut damim and Gilui Arayot. That's not between man and God. That's between man and man. But then, he says, Ki'im if you are silent, right? If you turn a deaf ear, and here's now where God enters the picture again, and where Mordechai shows his commitment to Hashem and to religion and to monotheism and to that whole belief, part of the belief system, right? Revach v'hatzala, yamduli Yehudim mimakom acher, right? This is the brit. This is the promise that Hashem made to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, is that you will not be wiped out. And Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, right? That was in last week's Haftarah. When Hashem makes a promise, he sticks with this promise. And even though it looks like we're going to be wiped out now, we're not, because Hashem has made a promise. And Hashem told Yirmiyahu that you're going to be in exile and you're going to come back and you're going to rebuild a Beit HaMikdash, and I'm not going to abandon you. And then he adds at the end, and he says, right, in famous line, Umi Yodeya im la'et kazot higat lamalchut, right? Who knows what God's plan is? There is a plan here. So what's moving Mordechai is this combined commitment to his people and to his God. And those are the main things behind him. And then Esther hears it, right? Because what is Esther's response in one pasuk? It's a commitment to her people and to her God, right? Lech knos et kol haYehudim hanimtzaim b'Shushan, right? Gather them all together. Bring them all together. V'tzumu alai v'al tochlu v'al tishtu shloshet yamim laila v'yom. And we know that this coming together and this fasting is davening. That's what we do. We fast. Fasting and prayer, fasting and tshuva all go together. But in one line, we have kind of the opposite of Gilui Arayot, Shvichut Damim, and Avodah Zarah. We have the opposite of abandoning God and abandoning our responsibility to one another. We have come together as a people, right? Identify as a people together and reconnect with God. And she says, and I'm going to do the same thing. And even though I'm in the palace, I'm going to do the same thing. I know, right? I and my maids are going to do things. And then, excuse me, u'b'chein avo el hamelech, right? And we know that hamelech is code word for God, but what she's saying is that I, the individual Esther, the Jewess, right, as just a member of the Jewish people, I am going to come before the king, right? And by the way, there's a lot of, right, Lashon Yachid here, right? Ve'anochi avo, I, u'b'chein avo el hamelech, right? Ve'aksher lo kedad, I'm going to break the law, ve'ka'asher avadati, right? That the I is very much an undertone here, that I am, again, I am just like you, Mordechai, are willing to die for the sake of your values. And to some degree, just like Vashti was willing to die for the sake of her values, I'm willing to die for the sake of my people and my values. What's interesting, and this is kind of the last thing that I'll say here, is that Esther is very much a mystery to us, right? So her name is, right, Esther, that she is Hadassah, but she is called Esther, that how, she's the most unlikely person to end up being the queen, that she seems the most passive and the most modest, and then is thrust into, like, literally, seemingly overnight, into this position of tremendous power and influence, right? What we need to remember is that she has been the queen at this point for at least 7 years, if not more, right? Because it's the time of the assassination plot, which is the time of when Esther becomes queen. It is in that I think it's the 5th year of his reign. And Haman's casting of the lots and this whole episode is in the 12th year of his reign. So she's been queen and in there for 7 years. So she's had time to learn and to observe, right? And I think that one of the things that you can say motivates Esther is a need to follow the rules, right? Follow her husband's rule, follow her uncle's rule. She's very much a rule follower. And it's really, really hard for somebody who is a rule follower to break the rules. And it's, for Mordechai, breaking the rules or breaking Haman's rules seems to have been very easy. The question is who's making the rules, right? And when you are motivated by a combination, and I think this is one of the messages of Megillat Esther, when you are really motivated by both sides of the luchot, right? By Ben Adam Lamakom and Ben Adam Lechavero, not one or the other, but both of them in tandem, which is probably why, Kimu v'Kiblu, there's that reference that Chazal make that it's a second Matan Torah, right? Ish echad b'lev echad, and we're all like, this is all bound up, like the messages of Megillat Esther is at what price disunity and disharmony, and what benefit unity and harmony. So that is where I will leave you all, and I wish everybody a Chag Purim Sameach, wherever you all are, safe, sane, happy, healthy, and may we all emerge from this isolation with a renewed sense of gratitude for the friends and family that we have, and with a deeper appreciation of how Hakadosh Baruch Hu operates behind the scenes. Have a great day, everybody. Are there questions or comments, or I'm not necessarily going to see what's in the chat or in the chat box. I think, that can be sent to me at a later point. But at this point, if anybody has questions or comments that they want to share. If you want to talk, I'm reminding you, you have to hit the space bar. Okay, then. Yes, I've dumbfounded everybody. So again, I wish you all Chag Purim Sameach, and thank you, Matan, for the opportunity to teach and to be part of this Purim Yom Iyun. And I wish everybody a really great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Figure out how to unmute.